The grand ballroom of Ashbury Estate fell deathly silent, the music stuttering to a halt as hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on the Duke and the maid. His hand was still wrapped around her arm, a possessive, defiant gesture that challenged 1,000 years of tradition. "Get this creature out of my house," the Duchess commanded, her voice like shattered ice, echoing in the cavernous space. But Duke Adrian Ashbury didn't let go. Instead, he pulled the trembling maid, Lucy, closer, his voice a low growl that promised ruin for anyone who dared to touch her. "If she leaves," he declared to the horrified assembly, "I go with her." But he didn't know the true price of his rebellion. He didn't understand the web of lies and jealousy that was about to unravel, and he certainly didn't know that the woman he was protecting held a secret that could destroy them both. Could a love born in stolen moments and whispered secrets possibly survive the public disgrace designed to tear them apart? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world was still draped in the soft grey light of pre-dawn when Lucy Trent's day began. In the vast, empty ballroom of Ashbury Estate, she was a solitary ghost, her movements as silent and precise as the ticking of the great-grandfather clock in the hall. The air was cold, smelling of last night's extinguished candles, beeswax, and the faint, floral perfume of the Duchess that seemed to cling to every surface. Lucy's worn wool dress did little to ward off the chill that seeped from the gleaming marble floors, a cold that felt as if it had settled deep into the very bones of the house. Her task was to erase any trace of the previous evening's quiet gathering, to restore the room to its state of pristine, untouchable opulence. Her hands, chapped and reddened from lye soap but deft and gentle, moved with an economy born of endless repetition. She polished the ornate silver, buffed the mahogany tables until they shone like dark mirrors, and straightened the heavy velvet curtains that guarded the colossal windows. She worked with her eyes downcast, a habit drilled into her by Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, from her very first day. "Remember your place, Lucy," the woman's stern voice echoed in her memory, a constant refrain in the quiet corridors of her mind. "Good servants are neither seen nor heard. You are a pair of hands, nothing more." And so Lucy had learned to make herself small, to blend into the wallpaper, to become as invisible as the air itself. It was a strange existence, to be so intimately acquainted with the treasures of a family, to handle their delicate china and priceless artifacts, yet remain utterly separate from their world. She was a whisper in a house of declarations. As she polished a large, ornate silver platter, her own reflection swam into view. It was a fleeting, distorted glimpse, a pale, serious face framed by wisps of brown hair that had escaped her tight bun, and wide, watchful eyes that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken thoughts. For a moment, she saw not a servant, but just a girl who felt as ephemeral as the dust motes she diligently wiped away. The image vanished as she shifted the platter, and she was once again just a pair of hands, a tool to maintain the perfect gleaming facade of Ashbury. In a lavish study 2 floors above, Duke Adrian Ashbury felt the gilded walls closing in on him. The room was his cage, furnished with the weight of his lineage. Heavy oak bookshelves groaned with leather, bound volumes he never read. Stern, oil, painted ancestors stared down at him with disapproving eyes, and a fire crackled in the hearth, offering a warmth that never reached him. He was enduring another tedious meeting with his father, the old Duke, a man as rigid and unyielding as the marble statues in the garden. Several advisors, grey men with equally grey personalities, droned on about crop yields and tenant disputes. Adrian stared out the window, his expression a mask of profound boredom and entrapment. The world outside, a landscape of rolling green hills and ancient oaks, seemed more a prison than a paradise. He tapped a silver pen impatiently against a stack of documents, the rhythmic clicking the only outward sign of his internal rebellion. "Adrian, are you listening?" His father's voice cut through the haze of his thoughts, sharp and imperious. Adrian turned his gaze from the window. "Of course, father. The West Pasture drainage. Fascinating." His father's jaw tightened. "This is your future, your responsibility. It would do you well to show some interest. Which brings us to a more pressing matter." He gestured to one of the advisors, who cleared his throat. The topic shifted, as it so often did, to his impending strategic engagement. "Beatrice is a perfect match," his father stated. Not for the first time. Her family's influence will strengthen our position. This alliance is vital for the continuation of our legacy. Adrian felt a familiar wave of suffocation. Lady Beatrice was indeed socially impeccable. She was beautiful, cultured, and as cold and polished as the ballroom floor. The thought of being shackled to her for a lifetime, a union of finance and influence rather than affection, was a sentence he could barely comprehend. "My duty is to this family, Adrian, not to your fleeting moods," his father concluded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Adrian said nothing, merely inclining his head in a gesture of hollow acquiescence. His duty. The word was a brand on his soul. He was not a man, he was a title, a collection of obligations and expectations, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the dead hands of his ancestors. Later that night, the great house was submerged in a profound silence, a quiet so deep it seemed to have a weight of its own. Lucy was tasked with one final chore. Mrs. Gable, suffering from a headache, had sent her to the library to retrieve a book of herbal remedies. "And be quick and quiet about it," the housekeeper had warned, her voice tight with pain. "His Grace, the young Duke, sometimes reads late. Do not disturb him." Lucy hurried along the darkened corridors, her soft shoes making no sound on the thick carpets. She believed the library to be empty, a vast cavern of shadows and sleeping books. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a smell she had always found comforting. A single beam of moonlight cut through a gap in the curtains, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. She moved with purpose, her mind on the specific shelf Mrs. Gable had described. She knew the layout of this room as well as any other, a map etched in her mind through years of silent dusting and polishing. Believing she was completely alone, she turned a corner between two towering shelves too quickly, her focus entirely on her task. She collided with something solid, something warm and unyielding. A startled gasp escaped her lips as a stack of heavy, leather-bound books went crashing to the floor. The sound was an explosion in the stillness, a sacrilege against the sacred quiet of the night. "Your Grace," Lucy stammered, her heart leaping into her throat as she realized her mistake. Duke Adrian Ashbury stood before her, his face emerging from the shadows, his expression one of surprise rather than anger. "Forgive me, I am so sorry, I didn't see." Her words tumbled out in a panicked rush as she dropped to her knees, her hands fumbling to gather the scattered volumes. "It's quite all right," Adrian said, his voice lower and softer than she had ever heard it. He knelt beside her, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the confined space. The scent of him, a clean, masculine fragrance of sandalwood and night air, filled her senses. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same book. An unexpected jolt, a spark of pure, unadulterated electricity, shot up Lucy's arm. It was a sensation so alien and powerful that she froze, her fingers still hovering over his. He stopped too. In the dim, ethereal moonlight, he looked at her, truly looked at her, for the very first time. He saw past the drab uniform and the servant's deferential posture. He saw the startled, expressive eyes, the color of warm honey, wide with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't name. He saw the delicate curve of her cheek and the soft fullness of her lips, slightly parted in shock. In that instant, she ceased to be a part of the house's machinery. She became a woman, real and vibrant and utterly captivating. An impulse, sudden, reckless, and entirely foreign to his disciplined existence, seized him. It was a feeling of pure, unthinking desire, a rebellion against the boredom, the duty, the suffocating weight of his life. Before his conscious mind could register the madness of the act, he leaned in. He closed the small distance between them and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, a shocking, searing moment that shattered the world for both of them. It was nothing like the chaste, calculated pecks he had exchanged with women of his class. It was warm and soft, and tasted of innocence and unspoken dreams. For Lucy, the world simply stopped. The touch of his lips was a brand, a fire that spread through her veins, obliterating every thought, every fear, every rule she had ever known. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, deafening silence of her mind. He pulled back almost immediately, his eyes wide with a dawning horror at his own actions. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just done. The spell was broken. Lucy was left frozen, kneeling on the cold floor amidst the fallen books, her entire being vibrating with the aftershock of the kiss. The air crackled with the forbidden energy of their shared transgression. "Forgive me," Adrian breathed, his voice low and hoarse, barely a whisper in the cavernous room. I don't know what came over me." He stood abruptly, casting a long, distorted shadow in the moonlight. He stared at her for another heartbeat, his expression a maelstrom of confusion and a new, dangerous curiosity, before turning and vanishing into the deeper shadows of the library, leaving Lucy alone with the echo of his touch and the terrifying, exhilarating chaos he had just unleashed upon her quiet, ordered world. The day after the kiss was a torment of memory and newfound awareness. For Adrian, the world had shifted on its axis. The familiar routines of his life, the morning ride, the review of estate accounts, the stilted breakfast with his parents, all passed in a blur. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the moonlit library, replaying the shocking, electrifying moment his lips had met hers. It was an act of madness, a catastrophic breach of every code he was bound to uphold, yet he felt no regret. Instead, he was consumed by a desperate, gnawing need to see her again. He found himself scanning the servants as they moved through the great house, his eyes searching for a glimpse of brown hair and a slender frame. Before, they had been a faceless, uniformed army, a part of the architecture. Now, one of them had a face, a name he didn't even know, and eyes the color of warm honey. He saw her twice that morning. The first time, she was crossing the great hall, carrying a heavy bucket, her head bowed, the very picture of the invisible maid she was trained to be. But she was no longer invisible to him. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the weary set of her shoulders, the way she seemed to shrink into herself to avoid notice. A pang of something sharp and protective went through him. The second time, he saw her in the library, the scene of his transgression. She was dusting the very shelves where they had collided, her movements hesitant, her gaze darting nervously towards the spot where they had knelt. As she worked, her eyes lingered for a moment on a thick volume about botany, its pages filled with detailed illustrations of wildflowers. The glance was brief, almost imperceptible, but Adrian saw it. He saw the flicker of longing in her expression before she caught herself, her professional mask snapping back into place. He knew then what he had to do. Waiting until the library was empty, he went to his desk. His hand, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he tore a small sheet from his personal stationery. Dipping his pen in the inkwell, he hesitated. What could he possibly say? An apology felt inadequate, an explanation impossible. He settled for simplicity, for a plea. Asterisk, I must speak with you. Please. Asterisk. The words looked stark and desperate on the fine, cream-colored paper. He added the location, a place of forgotten privacy, a place from his boyhood explorations. Asterisk, the old conservatory. Midnight. Asterisk. He folded the note into a tiny, tight square. Returning to the shelves, he found the botany book she had looked at. With a feeling of profound and reckless hope, he slipped the note between the pages depicting a cluster of wild bluebells and slid the book back into its place. The act was done. He had thrown a stone into the placid, ordered waters of his life, and now he could only wait for the ripples. Lucy's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the feather duster. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and confusion. The memory of the Duke's kiss was a brand on her lips, a secret fire that both warmed and terrified her. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant voice sent a jolt of panic through her. She felt exposed, as if her sin was written across her forehead for all to see. When she was sent to dust the library, her heart hammered against her ribs. The room felt charged, haunted by the ghost of their encounter. As she ran her cloth over the spines of the books, her fingers brushed against the botany volume. A strange, inexplicable curiosity made her pull it from the shelf. As she did, a small folded piece of paper fluttered out and landed silently on the carpet. Her blood ran cold. She glanced around, her heart in her throat, before snatching it up. Her name was not on it, but she knew. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the note. The words were few, but they held the weight of a death sentence or a revelation. Asterisk, I must speak with you. Please. The old conservatory, midnight. Asterisk. It was his handwriting, the elegant, forceful script of a man used to command. A wave of dizziness washed over her. He wanted to see her, alone, at midnight. Every instinct screamed at her to burn the note, to pretend it never existed, to bury the memory of the kiss so deep it could never surface. Discovery would mean instant dismissal, ruin, a life cast out into the unforgiving world with the stain of scandal upon her. Yet, a part of her, a foolish, treacherous, and utterly bewildered part, was drawn to the flame. Why had he done it? What did he want now? The questions echoed in the terrified silence of her mind. All evening, she was a ghost of herself, performing her duties on pure instinct, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. When the house finally fell into its deep nocturnal slumber, Lucy found herself standing before the small wooden door that led out of the servants' quarters and into the gardens. She was terrified, but the terror of not knowing, of living with the unanswered question of that kiss, was somehow worse. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slipped out into the cold night air. The old conservatory stood at the far edge of the gardens, a skeletal silhouette against the moonlit sky. It had been abandoned for years, a forgotten relic of a previous generation's passions. Grimy glass panes, some of them cracked, were webbed with ivy. Inside, nature had begun to reclaim its territory. Lucy pushed open the creaking door and stepped into a different world. The air was damp and smelled of rich earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet perfume of overgrown jasmine. Moonlight filtered through the dirty glass, painting everything in ethereal strokes of silver and shadow. Wild vines snaked across the floor and up the rusted iron framework, and the ghostly shapes of long, dead potted trees stood like sentinels in the gloom. He was there, standing by a large, empty stone basin where a fountain had once played. He turned as she entered, his face pale and anxious in the spectral light. "You came," he breathed, his voice filled with a relief so profound it startled her. The awkwardness between them was a palpable thing. He was a duke, and she was a maid. The chasm between their worlds seemed wider and deeper than ever in this strange, secret place. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a frightened whisper, "we cannot do this. If we are discovered, my life will be over." "Then we will not be discovered," he said, taking a hesitant step closer. He stopped, seeming to sense her fear. "I am sorry for what happened in the library. It was unforgivable. I was not myself." "Why did you do it?" The question escaped her before she could stop it, a raw plea for understanding. He looked away, towards the tangled silhouettes of the plants. "I don't have an answer that would make sense," he admitted, his voice low. "For a moment I felt free, and I wanted to... I don't know. I just knew I had to see you again, to apologize properly, to know your name." "It's Lucy," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Lucy," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "Please, when we are here, call me Adrian. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am more than just a title when I am with you." That first meeting led to another, and then another. The abandoned conservatory became their sanctuary, a hidden world where the rigid rules of the house outside ceased to exist. Over several secret nights, huddled together for warmth in the damp chill of the glass house, they began to talk. The initial awkwardness slowly melted away, replaced by a tentative, fragile intimacy. He spoke of the crushing weight of his future, of the suffocating expectations that had defined his entire existence. He told her about Lady Beatrice, about a marriage that was a contract, not a union of hearts. He confessed the profound loneliness of his gilded cage, a loneliness she, in her own way, understood completely. In turn, Lucy, emboldened by his vulnerability and the strange magic of their hidden world, began to open up. She spoke of her life before Ashbury, of a childhood that was simple but happy, cut short by the loss of her parents. She shared her simple, heartfelt dreams, dreams that seemed impossibly grand to her but achingly modest to him. "I've always imagined having a small patch of earth," she confessed one night, her voice soft in the darkness, "just to grow flowers. Something that is mine, something I can tend to and watch grow." He listened, captivated. In her quiet strength and her simple desires, he found an authenticity that was entirely absent from his own world of artifice and ambition. The power imbalance that had so defined their first encounters began to dissolve in the shared intimacy of their whispered secrets. He was no longer just the Duke, and she was no longer just the maid. They were Adrian and Lucy, two people finding a fragile connection in the shadows. He began to change in small ways. He showed up late to a formal dinner with Lady Beatrice's family, his mind still lingering on a conversation with Lucy from the night before, earning him a sharp reprimand from his father. He was becoming reckless, prioritizing the vibrant, real world he was building with Lucy over the stifling, predictable one he was born into. But their secret was a candle flame in a hurricane, beautiful and bright, but terrifyingly fragile. The immense risk they were taking was a constant, unspoken presence in their meetings. One night, the danger became terrifyingly real. After leaving Adrian in the conservatory, Lucy was slipping back towards the servants' quarters, her heart still glowing with the warmth of their conversation. As she moved down the long, dark service corridor, she heard the faint jangle of keys and the soft, measured tread of footsteps approaching. Her blood turned to ice. It was Mrs. Gable. A late night inspection. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. On pure instinct, Lucy wrenched open the door to a small linen closet and squeezed inside, pulling the door shut just as the housekeeper rounded the corner. She held her breath, pressing herself back against the rough shelves, the clean, starchy scent of folded linens filling her nostrils. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain Mrs. Gable must hear it. The footsteps slowed, then stopped, directly outside the closet door. Lucy squeezed her eyes shut, praying for invisibility, for the floor to swallow her whole. She could hear the housekeeper's soft breathing, the rustle of her stiff dress. An eternity seemed to pass. Then, with a soft sigh, the footsteps moved on, the jangling of the keys slowly fading down the corridor. Lucy remained frozen in the darkness for a long time, her body trembling uncontrollably. The near discovery had shattered the magical illusion of their secret world, replacing it with the cold, hard reality of their situation. The thrill of their clandestine meetings was now inextricably bound with the paralyzing fear of being caught. As she finally crept back to her small, cold bed, Lucy was left with a single, terrifying thought. Their stolen moments of happiness were living on borrowed time, and the price of discovery would be more than she could bear to pay. The fear that had taken root in Lucy's heart after her near discovery by Mrs. Gable did not subside. It became her constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every passing day. Yet, her fear was matched in intensity by the magnetic pull of her clandestine meetings with Adrian. In the decaying grandeur of the conservatory, they had built a world of their own, a fragile bubble of intimacy that felt more real than the stone walls of the estate. Adrian, sensing her heightened anxiety, became even more tender, his actions a gentle reassurance against the terror that haunted her. He wanted to give her something, a tangible piece of their secret world that she could hold on to, a symbol of his devotion that existed outside the stolen moments in the moonlight. One night, as they sat on a cold stone bench, their shoulders touching, he pressed a small, velvet-wrapped object into her hand. "I wanted you to have this," he said, his voice a low murmur that was barely audible above the whisper of the wind outside. Lucy unwrapped it carefully. Lying in her palm was a silver locket. It was not a grand, jewel-encrusted piece like the ones worn by the Duchess or Lady Beatrice, but a simple, elegant oval, polished to a soft gleam, hanging from a delicate chain. It was exquisitely made, its simplicity speaking of a quiet, refined taste that was far too fine for a maid. "Adrian, I can't," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and alarm. "It's beautiful, but if anyone were to see it—" "They won't," he insisted gently. "You can wear it beneath your dress. It will be our secret." He took it from her, his fingers warm against her cold skin. Turning her around, he moved the collar of her drab uniform aside. The cool weight of the silver against her skin sent a shiver through her as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. It was a moment of profound intimacy, more so than any kiss they had shared. His fingers lingered for a second on her skin, a silent promise in the shadows of the garden. "Now," he whispered, his lips close to her ear, "you carry a piece of me with you, always." Lucy touched the locket, which was now hidden beneath the rough fabric of her dress. It felt like a secret heartbeat against her own, a constant, dangerous, and wonderfully precious reminder of the man who was risking everything for her. The locket became her talisman. In the long, grueling hours of her workday, when she felt most invisible and alone, she would press her hand to her chest, feeling the cool, solid shape of it beneath the cloth. It was a source of reassurance, a secret strength, but it was also a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. It was a piece of evidence, a single damning object that could unravel their entire world. And it did not remain a secret for long. A few weeks later, during a formal dinner, Lucy was helping to serve the main course. The dining room was a glittering spectacle of crystal, silver, and candlelight, the air thick with the scent of roasted pheasant and the murmur of polite, aristocratic conversation. As Lucy leaned forward to place a dish on the table, the locket, which she had carelessly allowed to hang outside her uniform for a moment while working in the hot kitchens, swung forward. For a single fatal second, it caught the candlelight, a brilliant flash of silver against the dark grey of her dress. It was a tiny detail in a room full of opulence, but it did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Gable, standing sentinel by the sideboard, saw it. Her eyes, sharp and perpetually disapproving, narrowed to slits. Lucy, feeling the head housekeeper's gaze upon her, quickly tucked the locket back inside her dress, her heart beginning to pound with a familiar, sickening dread. She got through the rest of the dinner service in a haze of panic, her movements stiff and clumsy. She knew what was coming. Later that night, as she was scrubbing the last of the great copper pots in the scullery, Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim authority. "A word, Lucy," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She led Lucy into her small, austere office and closed the door. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a small clock on the mantelpiece. "That was a very fine piece you were wearing tonight, Mrs." Gable began, her eyes boring into Lucy. "For a girl of your means, your family must have been quite wealthy before falling on hard times, is that it?" The question was laced with a heavy, biting sarcasm. Lucy's mind raced. She was a poor liar, her honest nature making deceit a foreign language. It was my mother's," she stammered, the lie feeling clumsy and false on her tongue. "A family heirloom." Mrs. Gable let out a short, humorless laugh. "An heirloom? How convenient. I have been in service for 30 years, my girl. I know the look of quality, and I know the look of a liar." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are playing a very dangerous game. I don't know where you got that locket, but I have my suspicions, and I warn you, for your own good, end it now. The higher you fly, the harder you will fall, and a girl like you has a very, very long way to fall indeed." She dismissed Lucy with a flick of her hand, but her words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy of doom. Lucy fled back to the safety of her small room, her hand clutching the locket, which now felt less like a treasure and more like a millstone around her neck. Mrs. Gable was not the only one whose suspicions were aroused. Lady Beatrice, Adrian's intended, was no fool. She had felt the shift in him for months. He was distant, distracted, his polite indifference replaced by a veiled restlessness she couldn't penetrate. He fulfilled his duties to her, attending dinners and social calls, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Her pride was wounded, but more than that, her territorial instincts were on high alert. Adrian was her prize, the key to securing her family's status and her own future. She would not allow some fleeting distraction to jeopardize that. Her attention, sharp and calculating, began to narrow in on the staff. She started observing the maids with a cold, analytical gaze, searching for any sign of impropriety, any flicker of familiarity that might explain Adrian's behavior. And her eyes, like Mrs. Gable's, eventually settled on Lucy. It was nothing she could prove, just a collection of small, almost imperceptible details. A lingering glance from Adrian as Lucy left a room, a faint blush on the maid's cheek when he spoke a polite word to her, and a certain quality in Lucy's demeanor, a quiet inner light that Beatrice, in her jealous fury, interpreted as defiance. "There's an insolence in that one's eyes," she remarked to her mother one afternoon as they watched Lucy arranging flowers in the grand hall. "The Duke is far too lenient with the staff. It encourages familiarity. It gives them ideas above their station." Her mother had merely nodded, but Beatrice had already declared a silent war. Lucy became the focus of her cold, simmering rage, a target for her cruel, subtle torments, a misplaced bucket of dirty water that Lucy was forced to clean up. A false accusation of theft that was later cleared up with a dismissive wave. Beatrice was testing the waters, prodding and poking, waiting for a reaction, waiting for a mistake. The mistake came during a formal luncheon held in honor of a visiting lord, a man whose political influence Adrian's father was desperate to court. The atmosphere was thick with social importance. Lucy, her nerves already frayed from the constant scrutiny of Mrs. Gable and Lady Beatrice, was tasked with serving the soup. Her hands trembled as she carried the heavy silver tureen on a tray. As she approached the table, moving carefully behind the seated guests, Lady Beatrice, who was seated next to the guest of honor, shifted in her chair. She accidentally stuck out her elegant, silk, slippered foot directly in Lucy's path. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. Lucy's foot caught on Beatrice's, and she stumbled. For a horrifying, slow-motion moment, she fought for balance, but the heavy tray was too much. It tilted, and a wave of hot, creamy asparagus soup cascaded downwards, splashing all over the expensive waistcoat and breeches of the visiting lord. A collective gasp went through the room. The lord sputtered in shock and outrage, jumping to his feet. The Duchess's face went pale with horror. Mrs. Gable, standing by the wall, looked as if she might faint from sheer mortification. But Adrian saw none of it. His world narrowed to a single point of focus: Lucy. While everyone else stared at the spluttering lord and the spreading green stain, Adrian's first and only reaction was to rush to Lucy's side. He ignored the important guest completely. He ignored his mother's frantic gestures and his father's thunderous expression. He knelt on the floor beside Lucy, who was frozen in a state of pure, abject horror, staring at the mess she had created. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a mask of fury and concern, loud in the sudden, deathly silence of the room. He reached out and took her arm, his touch gentle. "Did you burn yourself?" The room went utterly still. Every eye was now on them, on the Duke kneeling on the floor, his hand on the arm of a clumsy maid, his face showing a level of concern that was shockingly, inappropriately familiar. The spilled soup, the insulted lord, the social disaster, all of it faded into the background. The real scandal was this public display of affection that shattered the invisible wall between master and servant. Lady Beatrice watched, a small triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had set the trap, and he had walked right into it. Later that night, in the cold safety of the conservatory, Lucy was trembling, not from the chill, but from the aftershock of the day's events. "They know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't meet Adrian's eyes. "I can feel it. Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Gable, they are watching me. She tripped me, Adrian. I know she did." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading terror. "This is getting too dangerous. Your reaction today, everyone saw. Everyone knows how you feel." She took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold herself together. "We have to stop," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "before they destroy us both." Adrian's pleas had been desperate, his words a torrent of promises and reassurances that had worn down her resolve. He had refused to accept her decision to end things, arguing that their fear would be the very thing that destroyed them, not the outside world. He had insisted on one more meeting, a final defiant gesture on the night of the annual Ashbury Masquerade Ball, the grandest, most public event of the year. It was madness, a flagrant invitation to the very disaster Lucy dreaded. Yet she had agreed. Her terror was a living thing inside her, but the thought of never seeing him again, of severing their connection without a true farewell, was a pain she could not bring herself to face. The estate was transformed into a glittering fantasy. Hundreds of candles blazed in chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 rainbows through crystal glasses and diamond necklaces. The air hummed with the soaring notes of a string quartet and the murmur of 100 conversations, all hidden behind the artifice of velvet, silk, and papier-mâché masks. It was the pinnacle of their society, a dazzling display of wealth and power, and tonight it was the stage for Lady Beatrice's final, triumphant act. She sat near the grand entrance to the ballroom, a vision in ice, blue silk, her mask, a delicate creation of silver filigree and frost, like crystals. She watched the dancers, her expression one of polite amusement, but her mind was a cold, sharp instrument of calculation. Earlier that week, a quiet, desperate kitchen maid with a sick mother had, for the price of a few gold sovereigns, tearfully confirmed everything Beatrice already suspected. She knew about the conservatory, and she knew about the new plan, a meeting in the secluded rose garden, timed to coincide with the midnight fireworks display. Beatrice felt a venomous thrill course through her. The trap was set. All she had to do was spring it. She saw Adrian moving through the crowd, a dark, commanding figure in a simple black domino mask that did little to conceal his restless energy. He was looking for someone, but his eyes were not scanning the masked faces of the aristocratic ladies. They were darting towards the service doors, towards the shadows, where the invisible staff scurried to keep the grand machine running. Beatrice's lips curved into a smile beneath her mask. It was almost time. The first firework exploded in the night sky, a percussive boom that momentarily silenced the orchestra. The guests began to drift towards the grand terrace to watch the display. This was her cue. Excusing herself from her small circle, Beatrice did not head for the terrace. Instead, she slipped away down a quiet corridor, her movements swift and silent. She found her parents already waiting, as arranged, their faces tight with grim anticipation. A short walk away, near the Duke's private study, they met with the Duke and Duchess of Ashbury. The Duchess's face was a mask of regal composure, but her eyes held a glint of cold fury. She had been informed of a potential, embarrassing indiscretion. Beatrice had framed it as a concern, a desire to protect the family's honor from Adrian's foolishness. Now, with her audience assembled, she was ready to raise the curtain. The rose garden was a world away from the noise and glitter of the party. Here, the only light came from the moon and the intermittent, brilliant flashes of the fireworks overhead. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of late, blooming roses. Lucy stood in the shadows of a marble statue, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She wore her plain maid's uniform, a stark contrast to the opulence just a stone's throw away. She had seen Adrian slip out of the ballroom and had followed, her feet moving as if of their own accord. He found her by the fountain, the water silenced for the winter. "Lucy," he breathed, pulling off his mask. In the chaotic, strobing light of the fireworks, his face was a study in desperation and longing. He came to her, taking her hands in his. They were ice, cold. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Adrian, this is insane." "It's the only sane thing in my life," he countered, his grip tightening. Another firework, a shower of emerald green and sapphire blue, lit the sky, illuminating the anguish on his face. "I cannot lose you, Lucy. I will not." The magic of the moment, the unreality of the masks and the distant music, the percussive heartbeat of the explosions in the sky, it all conspired to make them reckless. The danger that had haunted them for weeks seemed to melt away, replaced by a desperate, all-consuming need. He pulled her towards him, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. He crushed his lips to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of rebellion, of a love that had been forced to live in darkness and was now screaming its existence into the night. It was a culmination of every stolen moment, every whispered secret, every shared dream in the damp, earthy confines of the conservatory. For a glorious, terrifying instant, there was no duke, no maid, no rules, no consequences. There was only the two of them, fused together under a sky that wept tears of fire and light. Lucy's fear dissolved into pure sensation, the feel of his lips, the strength of his arms, the frantic beating of his heart against hers. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and terror of the past months, a silent surrender to the beautiful, ruinous fate she could no longer outrun. It was in that moment of total, blind surrender that the world ended. "Mother, Duchess," a voice, sweet as honey laced with poison, cut through the air. "I was just taking a stroll to admire the roses and, oh my goodness, look." They sprang apart as if burned. A bright, unwavering light sliced through the darkness, pinning them in its glare. Beatrice stood at the entrance to the garden path, holding a lantern high. Its golden light illuminated them completely, caught in their shocking, undeniable embrace. And behind her, emerging from the shadows, was the audience she had so carefully assembled, her own parents, their faces masks of horrified indignation, and far worse, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbury. The Duchess's face was no longer composed. It was a canvas of pure, unadulterated fury, her mouth a thin white line of rage. The old Duke stood beside her, his expression one of utter disbelief and profound, crushing shame. A collective gasp rippled through the small, powerful contingent. In the sudden silence between firework explosions, the sound was as loud as a scream. The magic of the garden shattered, the beauty of the moment twisting into something ugly, sordid, and unforgivably public. The Duchess was the first to recover, her shock solidifying into a terrifying, icy calm. Her eyes were fixed on Lucy, not as a person, but as a stain, a piece of filth that had contaminated her perfect world. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it trembled with a rage so profound it seemed to shake the very air. "You have shamed this family," she hissed, each word a venomous dart. "You have shamed your name. You have brought your gutter filth into my home." She turned her head slightly, her gaze falling upon two burly estate guards who had followed the procession at a discreet distance. "Guards," she commanded, her voice like the crack of a whip, "get this creature out of my house." The guards, their faces impassive, moved forward. Lucy was frozen, her mind a white void of terror. This was it, the nightmare from which she could not wake. But before they could reach her, Adrian moved. He stepped directly in front of Lucy, shielding her with his body. He was no longer the bored, restless aristocrat. He was a lion, his face a mask of pure volcanic rage, his eyes blazing with a dangerous fire. "Touch her," he growled, his voice low and menacing, a sound that promised ruin. "And you answer to me." The guards hesitated, caught between the authority of the Duchess and the fury of her son. The Duchess's face contorted with disbelief. "Adrian, step aside this instant." "No," he said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He glanced back at Lucy, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again as he faced his mother. He raised his voice, ensuring everyone in the horrified assembly could hear his proclamation, his final, irrevocable act of rebellion. "If she leaves," he declared, his words a gauntlet thrown at the feet of his entire world, "I go with her." "Have you lost your mind?" His father, the Duke, finally exploded, striding forward and grabbing Adrian's arm. "You are destroying everything, our name, our position, your future, for a common serving girl." Adrian shook off his father's hand with contemptuous ease. "What is our name but a cage? What is my future but a sentence you wrote for me?" He shot back, his defiance absolute. "This is the only thing that has ever been real." But his defiance, as passionate as it was ultimately futile against the cold, hard mechanics of power. The Duchess, her face white with a rage that had moved beyond words, gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the guards. It was all the command they needed. While the Duke continued to argue with Adrian, physically trying to restrain him, the two guards lunged forward. They bypassed Adrian's defense, their movements swift and practiced. One guard grabbed Lucy's left arm, the other her right. Their hands were like iron vices, their grip rough and impersonal. A scream tore from Lucy's throat, a sound of pure terror and disbelief. They were dragging her, pulling her away from Adrian, away from the rose garden, back towards the world of harsh, unforgiving reality. "No!" Adrian roared, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. He fought against his father, trying to get to her, but the old Duke, surprisingly strong, held him fast. "Let her go, let her go!" Lucy's feet stumbled on the gravel path as the guards hauled her unceremoniously through the gardens, past the terrace, where oblivious guests still laughed and pointed at the sky. She was a spectacle of shame, a ruined girl being dragged to her fate. They didn't take her through the house. They dragged her around the side, to the main gates of the estate. One of the guards unlocked the heavy iron gate, and with a final brutal shove, they threw her out onto the cold, damp dirt of the public road. She landed hard on her hands and knees, the sharp stones tearing at her skin. A moment later, a small, pathetic bundle was tossed into the dirt beside her. It was her few belongings, her spare uniform, the worn book of poetry her mother had given her, all tied up in a rough cloth. The iron gate clanged shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing like a death knell in the night. From behind the gate she could hear Adrian's voice, a desperate, enraged shouting of her name. "Lucy, Lucy!" It was a sound of pure agony, a cry of a man being torn apart, but it was distant, muffled by the iron and stone that now separated their worlds forever. Then, another firework exploded overhead, a brilliant, beautiful cascade of golden light, illuminating the pathetic, lonely figure of a girl on her knees in the mud, with nothing left in the world but the clothes on her back and the sound of a heart-shattering scream fading in the distance. The cold seeped into Lucy's bones, a damp, unforgiving chill that had nothing to do with the night air and everything to do with the utter emptiness that had replaced her heart. She remained on her knees in the dirt for a long time, the echoes of Adrian's screams fading into the indifferent chirping of crickets. The world had been reduced to the rough texture of the stones beneath her palms and the pathetic sight of her small bundle of belongings lying in the mud. Shock was a merciful blanket, insulating her from the full force of her new reality. Slowly, mechanically, she got to her feet. Her body ached, a dull protest against the brutal efficiency of the guards. She picked up her bundle, wiped the worst of the mud from it, and began to walk. There was only one place to go, the nearby town of Oakridge, a few miles down the road. With each step, the shock began to recede, and the pain flooded in. It was a pain so vast and sharp it was difficult to breathe. Humiliation burned her cheeks, hot and shameful. The image of the Duchess's face, contorted with hate, was seared into her mind. The feel of the guard's hands, the finality of the gate slamming shut, it all replayed in a torturous loop. She was a pariah, cast out not just from a house, but from the only life she had known. The news of the scandal, she soon discovered, travelled on wings faster than her own weary feet. It was a juicy piece of gossip, a tale of a duke's son and a lowly maid, and it spread through the countryside like wildfire. By the time she reached the tired, grey streets of Oakridge at dawn, her reputation had preceded her. She sought work the only way she knew how. She went to the back doors of the town's more prosperous houses, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, and asked for the housekeeper. The first door was slammed in her face before she could finish her sentence. At the second house, a stern, thin-lipped woman looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "You're the Ashbury maid, aren't you?" The woman sneered. "We'll have no scandal here. Be on your way." The words were a slap, a confirmation of her new status as human refuse. It was the same everywhere she went. Her connection to the Ashbury scandal was a brand, a mark of shame that made her untouchable. Hope, a fragile seedling to begin with, withered and died with each rejection. Destitute, hungry, and with the last of her courage crumbling, she found herself at the industrial edge of town, where the air was thick with coal smoke and the clatter of machinery. A huge, grim-looking brick building belched steam into the sky, a sign above its door reading, "Oakridge Commercial Laundry." It was a place of last resort, a place for those with no other options. It was a place for her. The foreman, a large, sweating man with a perpetually sour expression, barely glanced at her. He needed bodies to feed the insatiable appetite of the laundry's great machines, and he didn't care about their pasts. He grunted, pointed towards a chaotic, steaming room filled with women, and told her she could start immediately. The work was a circle of hell she could never have imagined. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the acrid smell of lye soap and steam so dense it was like breathing water. Her job was to stand at a massive, scalding tub, plunging endless piles of white sheets and linens into the boiling chemical-laced water, agitating them with a heavy wooden paddle. The sheets were from hotels, hospitals, and wealthy houses, the anonymous laundry of a world she no longer belonged to. Her hands, already chapped from her work at the estate, were raw and blistered by the end of the first day. Her back screamed in protest, and her spirit felt as if it were being bleached away along with the stains on the linen. She was truly invisible now, not in the practiced, careful way of a good servant, but in the anonymous, soul-crushing way of the desperate. She worked from before sunrise until after sunset, and at the end of the week, she was paid a pittance that was just enough to afford a bed in a cold, draughty room in a boarding house filled with the other broken spirits of the town. She endured, fueled by a grim, stubborn determination to simply survive. The memory of Adrian was a distant, painful ache, a dream of a life that had been burned to the ground. She felt abandoned, hurt, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Back at Ashbury, Adrian was living in his own version of hell, a gilded cage rattling with the echoes of his rage and despair. The moment Lucy had been dragged away, something inside him had snapped. He had been confined to his rooms, with guards posted at his door. His father, his face a mask of cold fury, had cut off his access to all funds, effectively making him a prisoner in his own home. He was subjected to an endless barrage of lectures, threats, and emotional blackmail. His mother refused to even look at him, her silence a more potent weapon than any shouted words. They were all aimed at a single goal, forcing him to renounce Lucy, to publicly declare the affair a moment of youthful folly, and to immediately proceed with the engagement to Lady Beatrice to repair the catastrophic damage to the family's reputation. During one particularly venomous confrontation in the Duke's study, his father laid out the final ultimatum. "You have brought shame and ridicule upon a name that has been respected for 500 years, the old Duke said, his voice shaking with a rage that was almost reptilian. "You will write a letter of apology to Beatrice's family. You will announce your engagement. You will do your duty, or you are no longer my son. This family will not be brought down by a serving girl." Adrian, who had been staring out the window at the manicured grounds that now felt like a prison yard, turned slowly. His face was calm, his eyes cold and clear. The volcanic rage had burned away, leaving behind an unbreakable resolve. His obsession had been forged in the fires of injustice and loss, and it had become something new, something absolute. "Then I am no longer your son," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a death sentence. "You can keep the title. You can keep the money and the land and the name." He took a step towards his father, his gaze unwavering. "It has been a cage my entire life. Lucy was the first person to ever make me feel free. You took that from me. You threw her to the wolves. You can have your legacy. I want no part of it." That night, Adrian made his escape. He waited until the house was deep in slumber, the guards at his door drowsy and inattentive. He didn't go through the door. He went through the window, climbing down the thick ivy that clung to the stone walls, a route he hadn't used since he was a boy sneaking out for midnight adventures. He landed softly on the damp earth of the garden. He didn't head for the stables, which he knew would be watched. Instead, he made his way to a small, hidden paddock at the far edge of the estate, where he kept a spirited black stallion named Shadow, a horse loyal only to him. He had no saddle, only a bridle he had hidden there weeks ago. With nothing but the clothes on his back, a few gold coins in his pocket, and a valuable watch his grandfather had left him, he swung himself onto the horse's back. He urged Shadow not towards the main road, but onto a secret riding path, overgrown and forgotten, that wound its way through the woods, a path that would take him to Oakridge and away from Ashbury forever. He rode into town as the sun was rising, a man stripped of his identity. He was no longer Duke Adrian Ashbury. He was just Adrian, a man on a desperate mission. His search for Lucy was frantic but systematic. He started with the inns, describing her to every innkeeper, his voice tight with urgency. He moved on to the shops, the bakeries, the dressmakers, any place a young woman might seek employment. With each negative response, a knot of fear tightened in his gut. What if she had left town? What if something had happened to her? The thought was a physical pain, a spur that drove him onward. He was haunted by the image of her being thrown from the gates, by the sound of her scream. The guilt was a poison in his veins. This was his fault. His recklessness, his defiance, had brought this ruin upon her. After 2 days of relentless soul-crushing searching, he was beginning to lose hope. He had exhausted nearly every possibility. As he stood on a bleak street corner, the smell of coal smoke thick in the air, his gaze fell upon the grim brick building of the commercial laundry. A cold dread washed over him. He walked towards it, his steps slow, as if approaching a gallows. The windows were thick with steam, distorting the view within. He wiped a clear patch on the grimy glass with his sleeve and peered inside. And then he saw her. The room was a chaotic vision of steam and frantic movement, but he saw her as if she were the only person there. Her face was pale and drawn. Her hair, once so lustrous, was damp and stringy, plastered to her forehead. Her movements were slow, heavy with an exhaustion that seemed to have settled into her very bones. She was lifting a heavy wooden paddle, her expression one of dull, listless resignation. The sight of her, so broken and weary, shattered what was left of his heart. This vibrant, intelligent woman who dreamed of flower gardens was trapped in this industrial nightmare because of him. He didn't hesitate. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the suffocating heat and noise. The other women barely glanced at him, their faces blank with fatigue. He walked towards her, his boots echoing on the wet stone floor. "Lucy," he called out, his voice cracking, breaking with the weight of his guilt and relief. She stopped, the paddle held motionless in the steaming water. She looked up, her eyes slowly focusing on him as if trying to make sense of an apparition. Her expression was a heartbreaking mixture of utter disbelief, deep residual pain, and a flicker of the old fear he knew so well. It was not the joyful reunion he had fantasized about during his desperate search. It was a meeting of two survivors, two people irrevocably broken by a world that had torn them apart, standing in the ruins of what they had lost. "Adrian?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, the name a ghost on her lips. "Lucy," he said again, taking another step closer, his hands outstretched as if to prove he was real. "Thank God. I've been looking everywhere for you." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of shame and sorrow. "I am so sorry," he choked out, the words a raw, inadequate plea for a forgiveness he did not deserve. "I am so sorry for what they did to you." Adrian led her away from the suffocating heat and noise of the laundry, his hand a steady, protective presence on the small of her back. He didn't speak much, as if he understood that words were useless against the trauma she had endured. He simply guided her through the winding streets of Oak Ridge until they came to a stop before a tall, narrow building with a bakery on the ground floor. The warm, comforting smell of baking bread, of yeast and sugar and life, wafted out to meet them, a stark contrast to the chemical stench that clung to their clothes. He led her up a narrow, creaking staircase to a set of rooms on the second floor. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing not a palace, but a haven. The rooms were small, clean, and humbly furnished with a sturdy wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed piled with fresh linens. Sunlight streamed through a large window that overlooked the bustling street below. It was the most beautiful place Lucy had ever seen. He gently sat her down on the edge of the bed and knelt before her. Without a word, he took her hands in his. They were a painful sight, red, raw, and blistered, the skin broken in several places. His expression was one of profound sorrow. He left for a moment and returned with a basin of warm water and a jar of soothing salve he must have purchased on his frantic search. He carefully, tenderly, began to clean her wounds. He worked in silence, his touch as gentle as a prayer. Lucy watched him, a storm of emotions warring within her, the pain of her ordeal, the shock of his return, the sheer overwhelming relief of his presence. As he gently wrapped her hands in clean bandages, the dam of her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her grimy cheek, then another, until she was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking with the force of her pent-up grief. Adrian finished his task, then simply sat on the floor before her, his head bowed, and let her cry. He didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He simply bore witness to her pain, his presence a silent apology, a steadfast anchor in the storm. In the days that followed, he tended to her with a devotion that was both heartbreaking and healing. He brought her food from the bakery below, coaxing her to eat. He read to her from a book of poems he had bought, his voice a low, steady murmur that soothed the frayed edges of her nerves. He proved his commitment not with grand declarations, but with the quiet, constant language of action. Yet, as Lucy's physical strength returned, her emotional defenses remained firmly in place. She was wary, distant, her eyes holding a haunted, watchful quality. She was terrified to let herself believe this was real. She had been cast out once, and the terror of being abandoned again was a wall around her heart. She was afraid that this was just another chapter in a story that would end with him leaving her, that he would eventually grow tired of this life of poverty and return to the world of wealth and privilege that was his birthright. The breaking point came one evening, a week after her rescue. They were sitting at the small table, the room filled with the soft glow of a single lamp. Adrian was telling her of his plans, of how he might find work using his knowledge of languages. His voice full of a hopeful energy she could not bring herself to share. She couldn't bear it any longer. The fear was a poison she had to draw out. "How can I know you won't grow tired of this?" she asked, her voice trembling, the words spilling out in a rush. "Of being poor? Of this little room? When this game is over, what happens to me? Do you leave me here when you finally go back to your real life?" Adrian looked stunned, his hopeful expression crumbling. He reached across the table for her hand, but she pulled back. "Lucy, this is not a game," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Isn't it?" she challenged, her own voice rising with a hysterical edge. "You are a duke. You were born to a life of unimaginable luxury. I was born to serve it. This," she gestured around the small, clean room, "this is a novelty for you. For me, it is a palace, but I know it is a prison of poverty to you. One day you will wake up and miss your horses, and your fine clothes, and the respect of the world, and you will leave. And I will be ruined all over again." He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He came around the table and knelt before her, just as he had on that first day. He took her bandaged hands in his grip firm, refusing to let her pull away this time. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze burning with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There is no after. There is no going back. There is only this, us." He took a deep breath, his heart bare in his eyes. That life, the title, the estate, it was a cage, a beautiful gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. "I have given it all up. I have formally renounced my name and my inheritance. I did it before I even knew if I would find you. I have nothing left of that world, Lucy, nothing but the memory of the pain it caused both of us. This," he squeezed her hands gently, "is the only thing that has ever been real to me. This is my real life, with you." He laid his heart bare, explaining that he had no intention of ever leaving, that he had chosen this, chosen her, with every fiber of his being. Lucy stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, any flicker of doubt. She saw only a raw, aching sincerity, a love so profound it stole her breath. The wall around her heart, built of fear and betrayal, began to crumble. She finally allowed herself to believe. A few weeks later, Adrian knew there was one final thread to his old life that he had to sever. He sold the one valuable object he had left, a heavy gold pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. It was a painful sacrifice, a final link to a past that held both good and bad memories, but it was necessary. He used the money to hire a horse and to buy a respectable, if simple, suit of clothes. He was going back to Ashbury, one last time. He wasn't going to beg or to plead. He was going to issue a declaration of independence. He arrived at the estate in the late afternoon, timing his visit for the dinner hour. He was not announced. He simply walked through the front doors, his presence causing the footman to stare in stunned silence. He strode unannounced into the formal dining room. The scene was just as he had left it, a tableau of cold, glittering opulence. His father and mother were at the table, along with Lady Beatrice and her parents. Their conversation stuttered to a halt, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. "Adrian," his father growled, rising halfway from his chair. "What is the meaning of this?" Adrian ignored him, his calm, cool gaze sweeping over the assembled party before finally settling on Lady Beatrice. She looked at him with a mixture of fury and triumph, believing he had come crawling back. "I have come to make a final clarification," Adrian said, his voice calm and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I am no longer your son, nor the heir to this estate. I formally renounce all claims to the Ashbury name, title and fortune, now and forever." The Duchess gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The Duke's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You are a fool," he spat. "Perhaps," Adrian conceded with a slight nod, "but I am a free fool." He then turned his full attention to Beatrice, whose triumphant expression had been replaced by one of confusion. He gave her a small, knowing smile, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I also wanted to wish you well, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more menacing. "I do hope your correspondence with the Count finds you well. Italy is so beautiful, I hear. It would be a shame if such private letters, especially to a married man, were to be misplaced and end up in the hands of a London gossip columnist." The colour drained from Beatrice's face, Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. She understood the threat perfectly. He had neutralized her. With that single subtle blow, he had ensured that she and her powerful family would never trouble him or Lucy again. He had learned to be ruthless, not for power or for wealth, but for love. Without another word, he turned his back on their stunned, silent faces and walked out of the house, out of the life that had almost destroyed him, and never looked back. The final scene of their story did not take place in a grand ballroom or a moonlit garden, but in a small, sunlit room above a bakery. Several months had passed. The city hummed with life outside their window, a constant, vibrant pulse that was the soundtrack to their new world. Adrian had found work, not as a duke, but as a man. His fluency in French and Italian, once a mere aristocratic polish, had become a valuable skill. He worked as a translator for a shipping merchant and tutored the sons of wealthy tradesmen. It was honest work, and he came home each evening tired but satisfied. Lucy, in turn, had found her own quiet joy. The wide windowsill of their main room was now home to a collection of wooden boxes, all overflowing with a riot of colorful flowers. Geraniums, petunias, and fragrant herbs spilled from the boxes, a testament to her patient, loving care. She had a garden. It was not a vast country estate, but a few feet of earth and sunlight, and it was hers. They were poor by the standards of their old world, but here, in this small apartment filled with the scent of baking bread and blooming flowers, they were richer than they had ever been. They had freedom, they had peace, and they had each other. The story ends with them sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and wine at their small table, the evening sun casting long, golden shadows across the room. Lucy looked from Adrian's face to the window boxes, where a new set of buds had just begun to open, their petals a vibrant, hopeful red. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within. "They're finally blooming," she said, her voice soft with contentment. Adrian reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a familiar, comforting gesture. He looked from the flowers to her face, his expression full of a love so deep and profound it was a tangible presence in the room. He leaned in and kissed her temple, a kiss not of desperate passion, but of quiet, enduring peace. "So are we," he whispered.